Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar on strategic brand management for education. I think there are still a couple of people coming in, but it's gone 3, so I think we'll just get started. One of my colleagues is controlling the slides, so we might occasionally have to be saying to move on with slides, but obviously we're all in different places, being COVID safe. Hopefully that won't disrupt things too much. So just a very brief introduction to Natives for people that might not know us. We're a student marketing agency with a growth mindset. We do specialise in student and university and education sector marketing, but we're really about helping you understand your audiences and make stronger connections with them. We really want you to be innovative and open to risk to try and make your budgets go as far as they can. So your team today is me, I'm Holly, I'm one of the account directors here. And we have Kaz, who's our director of research, Charlie, our creative director, and Tom, our director of advertising. The schedule for today is looking very focused on brand and how to manage brand effectively in a university setting. So we're going to first look at what is brand. We'll talk about a few of the common challenges that we've had conversations with people about over the last few years. We'll look at what is effective brand management, what students think of brand, and then we'll have a look at how brand and rankings interact. And finally, we'll focus on what you can do as a marketer in a university or perhaps a brand guardian or brand manager to manage your brand effectively. To start off with, what is brand? It is can be quite an intangible concept to define. So we've got a few quotes here from some people who are kind of in the know. So the first person here is Philip Kotler, who, if you've studied marketing, I'm sure you will have heard of him. He's an author and academic. And he says that brand is a distinguishing name or symbol intended to identify the goods or services to the seller and differentiate those goods and services from a competitor. So it's quite interesting. Brand is being set up here as quite a symbolic or kind of thing, and it also is about differentiation, defining who you are. The next quote that we have is Joanna Seddon. So Joanna leads Ogilvy's global brand consultancy practice. Obviously, she's then working with a lot of brands across the world, probably very big product-based brands. She says brands are a valuable asset of any corporation and should be treated like any other asset. This means it should be put to work to generate value and held accountable for the results. So she's looking at it as quite a tangible thing on that basis, and about measuring and getting value out of your brand and making it work for you. So it's not just something that exists in the background, it's something that you would actively be wanting to work for you as a marketer. And the final quote we have here, I quite like this one when you think about a university in particular. This is Seth Godin, who's an entrepreneur and author. And he says, a brand is a set of expectations, memories, stories, and relationships that taken together account for a consumer's decision to choose one product or service over another. So I think that's quite nice when you think about the kind of relationships people have with universities, is about relationships and forming memories. And we know as well, there's a lot of expectations involved as well there. So this seems like quite a nice fit for a university, really. And then moving on, I thought it would be quite nice to ask, what does brand mean to you? So if you use a definition of a brand in your job or your organisation, or you have a sort of way you think about brand, do share it with us in the questions section, which is on the right-hand side of the webinar. So we'd be interested to hear a bit about how you approach it, or whether you agree or disagree with any of those definitions that we just read out. Cool. So just moving on to some brand challenges. These are things that we've had conversations with clients and universities about over the last few years, and questions that seem to come up quite often. So the first thing is, what is our brand? Who are we? Are we distinctive? Are we different? Are we aligned with what students want? What should we be doing about this? I'd say is one area of things that comes up as a big challenge in a university setting. The second is more around measurement. So how good is, for example, brand awareness, brand familiarity, sentiment? What are people saying about us? Like, what do we know about ourselves? How do we stack up against the competition? And the third area is, I guess, more about sort of action, like what should I do to our brand? You know, should I be changing the brand? and if I want to do something like that, how am I getting everyone on board? Do I even need to get everyone on board? Which can be a fairly dreaded thought in some circumstances. But these areas are things that we're going to come back to later in the webinar and talk about, you know, maybe some solutions or way of approaching these things to kind of help you in a brand management role to be quite effective at doing that. The next thing I'm going to talk about is a very kind of not basic, but quite nice way to think about brand management. So if you split it into 3 separate areas, you could say it's approximately 1/3 diagnosis, 1/3 strategy, 1/3 tactics. So diagnosis is things like reflecting on what does the brand mean, measuring the brand, how do we monitor the brand, how do we evaluate the brand. The strategy is basically how we're managing it, so defining who we are and how we go about doing things. And the tactics is what we're actually doing, what we're delivering. And what we do tend to see is a lot of, you know, delivery, maybe not so much on the kind of evaluation or strategy side of things. So I think if you kind of look at it more as this kind of model, this is maybe a nice way if you're in a brand management position to split your time, or perhaps your budgets even, to reflect the 3 areas that do need to be covered for effective brand management. And again, we'll be coming back to some of these in a bit more detail later on in today's session. But what I'm going to do first is hand over to Kaz, because we ran some research with our panel to find out about how students view universities and brands.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, so firstly, to kind of set the scene, we asked students quite like a broad question just around how they would define a brand using free text responses. And from this, we found kind of 3 key themes: that a brand is something that has products, it sells a product, it's a business or a company that has a vision, and lastly, that it's recognizable. So it would have a name that you would know, it would have a clear logo and a slogan. So these are overarchingly how a student would describe a brand. We then wanted the audience to define which of these they thought were brands. So we gave them a randomly ordered list of brands from a variety of categories. And as we can see here, the 3 universities included were selected as brands by fewer respondents than any others in the list. So in terms of what students consider to be brands, Nike scored the highest, with 97% of students thinking this is a brand, followed by Cadbury's, Boohoo, Tesla, Audi and Gymshark, all things that I'm sure we would all consider brands as well. But interestingly, social media platforms scored lower than conventional companies, with 42% thinking of Instagram as a brand and 40% viewing TikTok as a brand. And as we said, the percentage of students who see universities as brands is the lowest, with 18% viewing University of Oxford as a brand, 13 and 12% of students respectively seeing Liverpool and Brighton University as brands. So if we consider the previous slide, where students told us that they thought brands had 3 key elements, so products, were a company of organisation with a vision, and they needed to be recognisable. Universities clearly have 2 out of 3, or arguably 3 out of 3, if we say that courses are products here as well. But there are clear differences here between how students view universities compared to this archetypal idea of a brand. So we therefore want to delve into this a bit further and understand where this discrepancy comes from. We asked students why they thought that a university was or was not a brand, which helped explain why students are less likely to view universities as brand than other industries. So those that said yes to a uni being a brand gave very similar reasons to those we've just seen. It has a logo, it has products, it makes money, it's got a clear identity, etc. But for the majority who were saying that university wasn't a brand, their answers were more focused around moralistic reasons, perceiving them as a public good. Providing a service of education is not the same as a product, not being focused on money. And these clear differentiators in the minds of students. But we then wanted to understand a bit more about the qualities for a brand and a university and how do these equate. So we asked students which of these would you associate with a strong brand, which of these would you associate with a strong university, across a range of factors that really should be mostly relevant to both universities and brands. The difference in perceptions that we've already seen continues here when we look at these consumer expectations, with this graph clearly showing an inverse relationship. So students associate universities most strongly with rankings, heritage, and that quality experience. And they think that some brands should have these, but predominantly these are more qualities for universities than brands. And while they associate brands with much more classic brand attributes, such as lots of advertising, big social media presence, slogans and logos. Again, these are all things that are applicable to university as well, but students don't see it in that way. The only factor that students equally associated with both a strong brand and a strong university was that it has good reviews, both of which 70% plus of students said they would associate with a strong brand and a strong university. But just because students don't perceive universities as brands in the classic way we might think of them, even though the attributes they associate with brands are applicable to universities, this does not mean that brand work is not needed. Awareness and cut through of your brand is important. Each year in National Clearing Survey and other surveys that we run, we find that students are very unlikely to apply somewhere without ever having heard of it before. From NCS, we know that 8 in 10 students told us last year they had heard of the university before they applied through clearing, showing that your brand does need to be present and needs to stick in students' minds. So some of those attributes students don't consciously associate with a good university or a brand and think about in more brand heavy elements are clearly needed here, and they are clearly applicable to a university. We then want to quickly explore rankings and their relationship with brand. So we all know that rankings are a massive thing in the higher education sector, but we don't really know how they're perceived in relation to brand, and therefore what extent do they impact the university choice. So firstly, we asked, how much did your university's ranking affect your views on whether to go there? And 3 in 4 students told us that rankings did affect their decision, either a lot or a little, in terms of where to shortlist, apply to, and finally where to go. So they definitely do play a part in the decision-making process. But we wanted to follow this with understanding what this really meant. Rankings might affect decisions, but what do rankings need to look like? When we asked students whether a good university has to have a high ranking, only 2 in 5 students stated that they thought it did. So although rankings are important, they aren't the be-all and end-all to their decisions. And finally, we wanted to understand then how students' perceptions of a university brand relates to their perceptions of its rankings. So we asked students 2 separate questions. How would you rate the following universities' brands? And how good do you think the following universities' rankings are? This graph shows the percentage of students that felt each of these were either a good brand or had good ranking. And for the sake of this webinar, we've just anonymised these universities, but they are all UK universities. And here we can see a clear pattern between students thinking that universities with strong rankings also have a stronger brand. And as the ratings for their brand goes down, so does their rankings. But what's interesting here, which you can't really see because we've anonymised it, but some of the higher rated universities here in terms of like their brands are not actually that high ranking, but the students' perceptions of them, perhaps due to their brand, improve maybe their views on what their rankings actually are. So I'm now going to pass it on to Holly, who's going to go through what steps we should focus on when trying to manage and improve brand.
Thanks, Kaz. So I think what we've seen, despite students' perceptions, universities are brands, and they certainly do kind of fulfil some of those definitions that we looked at earlier, and need to do that to be effective in terms of recruiting students, retaining students, all the other relationships that a university has with various stakeholders. We've also seen that rankings aren't everything, and that perceptions of rankings may play a bigger role than actual reality of rankings anyway. So while rankings play a part in defining your brand, there is plenty of work to be done outside of just relying on these to define and manage your brand. I'm going to hand back to Kaz in a minute. We're going to talk through those 3 pillars of brand management that we touched on earlier. So we're going to look at what you can do in sort of practical terms to measure your brand, what you can think about for your brand strategy, and what you need to think about for delivering your brand tactics as well. Before we jump onto that, and just looking through the Q&A section, we've had quite a nice definition, looking through them, that someone sent in here to say brand is the sum of every tangible and intangible association that others have with your organisation. And I think, again, a university has to be a brand if that's a definition of brand, because you are a business that's interacting with a really wide variety of different people. So yeah, I think I agree. I think that's quite a nice definition there. Right, great. Kaz, I'm going to hand back to you now for you to talk about how people might approach measuring and monitoring and evaluating their brand.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, so this first point then around measuring your brand. So we've kind of split this into 3 key areas that you should look to invest in when trying to measure your brand. Firstly, starting with a brand diagnosis. So really understanding how you're currently performing, what your competition looks like, where are your key areas of differentiation that will help you stand out in the marketplace. What is the awareness of your institution? So really talking to some of those key stakeholders, so that could be prospective students, parents of prospective students, maybe employers and businesses in the local area and further afield, to really understand actually how your brand is currently perceived, what is the awareness of your brand like, to kind of really benchmark that and understand then, if you then invest in it, what that improvement looks like, so you can measure that over time. Which feeds us into the second point, all around brand tracking. So really following your brand on a regular basis to see how the initiatives and how some of the things that Charlie and Tom are going to talk through in a second are helping to improve your brand, so that you can really understand the ROI on your marketing or advertising or creative activity when it comes to brand activity. And maybe there's key metrics that you want to be improving. Maybe your awareness is something which is quite low in maybe certain regions, and that's something you want to be focusing on, or maybe it's trying to get people to understand exactly what differentiates you as an institution and what you should stand for and what those values look like, and actually having your audience having a much better idea of the associations and the values that you stand for, and trying to improve that over time. It doesn't need to be everything, and I think it's focusing on some areas and improving those. And finally, understanding how your brand is impacting your share of voice and therefore your market share. Are you growing in market share, and what is this attributed to? And how does it compare against your competitor set? So understanding how the actions you take improve your brand awareness, perceptions, distinction, is then therefore actually impacting your bottom line and helping you grow the number of different students you're looking for, increase your share in certain markets or areas, or maybe increase revenue that comes from other streams, such as more work with businesses or employers. So I'm now going to hand over to Charlie, who's going to talk through a bit around brand strategy.
Thanks, Kath. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I think one of the biggest problems that marketers come up against when working on brand is sort of starting from the wrong angle and thinking what do people think about when they think about my brand? What do people think about when they think about our brand? And the reason that's wrong is nobody's wandering around thinking about your brand. What you need to be thinking about is when you want people to think about your brand. You know, what do you want to be known for? What do you want to really come front of mind for? And for universities, I mean, there's obvious things. There's being a provider of high quality education, but you know, in terms of being front of mind for delivering high quality education, there are some big beasts of brands. We saw them mentioned earlier, and I think it's about being a bit more creative and a bit more kind of true to your own potential, I suppose, true to your own capabilities in terms of what those things are. You know, the way that we would always recommend sort of thinking about brand strategy, thinking about where to start, is starting with problems, thinking about who your customers really are, what do they want, what are their problems, and how are you able to help them. And the other things, thinking back to you know, Holly's slide around the sort of architecture versus tactics and things like that, I think yeah, it's a common thing to overly focus on tactics, and personality and execution can change and can develop and can flex to different you know, to different applications and different circumstances. But I think as long as that focus and being really singular about a particular problem that your brand and your products are able to solve, that stays true, and the values and architecture infrastructure that backs that up stay true, stay consistent. That's the thing that's really important. You know, consistency isn't always being the same forever and sounding the same everywhere and looking the same everywhere and looking the same you know, for a long period of time. Those things change, they've got to change, you know, things change with the times, but I think it's the truth of the sort of meaning behind that. And yeah, so I think it's really about being rooted in real human problems, and building out from that. Cass, if you just want to skip on to the next slide, please. I just wanted to include this, and I mean, you may have seen our work with Study in Sweden from our website or in other presentations and things, but I think this is a good and clear execution of how a brand seeks to be known in the education space for a specific thing. And with Study in Sweden, you know, we came from this point of they don't have necessarily the most kind of internationally renowned, high quality higher education system. How else can we get cut through? What can we go after? What sort of problems can we solve? And so the problems that we really kind of zoned in on this was around students looking for a more learning in a more progressive society, learning in a place where progressive values, you know, around freedom, equality, gender, sexuality, identity, all those things were what students were after, and really kind of doubled down on that. And of course, the brand is bigger than just a poster or a billboard, an advert like this, and there's a whole kind of set of values and architecture around that. But all of it comes back to that idea of being and thinking progressive, of being open-minded, of freedom and fairness and equality. And this is a particularly kind of, I suppose, singular and punchy execution of that. But this was the approach we took there. I think there's another digital example on the next slide. And so for them, you know, the whole strategy was, as I say, just really being totally singular about that, singular with all they do. And you know, for them, there's a very kind of strong sense of personality, you know, and Swedishness coming through in that. But yeah, the real thing was just about kind of doubling down on being progressive. So I guess that's my sort of single recommendation really, is be super consistent, but know what you want to be known for, and when you want your brand to be thought of, not what people think about when they think about your brand, but when do you want people to think about your brand. Thank you. I think it's over to Tom now.
Thanks, Charlie. I realise there's been lots of information put forward in this webinar, so I'm going to be quick. I just want to cover 3 quick things for bringing a campaign to life. So if you could flick on to the next slide, please, Cass. So brand and DR can and do need to work together. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that we should stop doing direct response. There is a huge requirement for short-term campaigns, hitting open day numbers, open house or evening numbers, virtual or on campus, UCAS deadline requirements, enrollment, intake numbers, and obviously for undergraduate, there is clearing as well. But what the data shows in the top graph is that these short-term campaigns will create short spikes in growth, but will not drive an overall increase in the growth of the brand itself. So in the education sector, you know, due to recent challenging times we've experienced recently, it's been led to more and more use of direct response. And this has also been seen in the advertising industry as a whole, and you can see that indicated in the graphs on the bottom right, which show a kind of worrying trend of increased short-termism, but also a decrease in effectiveness as well. So the overriding point is to have an optimal mix of brand and DR. And what we're proposing is to have a section of your annual budget carved out for brand building and awareness, or if you have a campaign by campaign approach due to a budgeting perspective, then it's worth having a section within each campaign linked to growing and focused on your brand. From an advertising sector approach, it tends to be about 75% is like the optimal mix towards investment on brand, but that'll be driven by things like FMCG or everyday purchase brands, and not significant and important decisions like choosing to study at an institution. So we feel that a kind of 50, you know, maybe 60% is kind of optimal, and this will obviously vary from institution to institution. And remembering, as Charlie pointed out earlier, that when you go live, you're consistent and committed to the values of the brand. Can you go to the next slide, please, Cass? And just to build on the market share analysis that Cass mentioned earlier, I wanted to briefly talk through share of search. I mean, this is nothing new. It's a long time used metric, and we've used it in natives for years. You gather up the data for your brand, and do the same for your competitors, and you can aggregate that, divide the searches for your brand by the searches for all your competitors in the sector, and you will have a view of the share of search. This is obviously one metric, one part of the puzzle, and not the only one, but it's easy to track and much easier than share of voice, because share of voice is a way of seeing, you know, how big you are in the market, but it requires information on things around advertising spend. That's quite difficult to get in education sometimes, and normally by the time you can actually access it, it's a bit old, and therefore I think of it as a lagging indicator, a descriptive metric, important to have but hard to build strategy going forward upon when you're looking in the rearview mirror. I mean, in Google, as you can see the image on the right, have long held the belief that they are the biggest database of human intention, and there's been a recent discovery actually this month, October 2020, by Les Binet, and he has found that there is correlation between share of search and what will happen in terms of your share of market going forward. There seems to be a lag of about 6 months. So that means that's super interesting for us, you know, share of search presenting as a predictive measure, you know, a leading indicator of where your brand is heading to. And when you look at the anonymized data on the bottom of the slide, you can see very roughly, for demonstration purposes, and please don't, you know, this has just been put together to kind of display what I'm trying to present. You can see, you know, an institution's searches for their brand declining year on year on year. And then when we have a look at the UCAS market share data, you can also see that post 2010 that has been reflected as well. And I feel it was just very interesting, and you know, there's some kind of correlation there, and you know, but this is very top line, and you need to have a much more kind of scientific view. But the reason for me raising this search element is we know that organic searches are an indicator that advertising can actually impact, and pretty quickly. You'll see an uplift in searches following, you know, good, strong brand campaigns. But what the researchers found is that short-term uplift will be there, but then also there'll be a prolonged long-term, long-tail effect. And that plays into a requirement for longer-term measurement. Just onto the last slide, Cass. So how do we get these campaigns live? There are kind of 3 major points of running a campaign, and how to get a prospect's attention, how to create an emotional connection, and how to drive action. And this requires the combination of the work that Cass and Holly have talked through around audience understanding, the brand strategy elements from Charlie, and then audience, you know, audience engagement, and then the advertising kind of audience acquisition, channel selection, you know, optimal timing, linking to relevant external factors, and the investment to make that impact. The questions here are linked to getting that edge over your competition. You know, when we think about how do we get attention, what is distinctive about your assets, your messaging, your channel choice? What is going to be noticed in the busy lives of students that makes it into being one of those 7 things that short-term memory can actually hold on to? And when we look at forging an emotional connection, what data do we have that drives the content, the platform choices, the publishers? You know, is it a student's perspective delivered through a YouTube video or a long-form piece of native content that we've developed? And then when we move into the action phase, you know, what are the messages that beat your close competitors and drive that individual to choose to study at your institution? And I think that's my final slide. So,
thanks, Tom. Yeah. Okay, so if anybody's got any questions, do put them into the question widget that's on the right-hand side of the webinar. I think there is a lot to think about there, and from Tom's section, you know, there can be quite a lot in delivery to consider as well. I think the key takeaway is that although it is complex and can seem very complex, it's not about necessarily doing it right, but it's about, you know, giving it a go. So start with that kind of that 3-part model, that diagnosis. The case study that Charlie talked through with study in Sweden started with actually a very big phase of diagnosis, measurement, understanding the brand, both from the customer's perspective, who were the prospective international students, but also the stakeholders involved, so some of the people working in universities in Sweden and the Swedish Institute. And that then helped inform what that strategy looked like. And therefore, when you come to delivering the tactics, it all goes back to actual kind of original insight and really understanding what's going to work for you. The double whammy of that as well is that you do get engagement with people and get them on board with you as you're moving through, and you make sure it has that truth to it, which Charlie talked about as well. So yeah, I think the takeaway really is to perhaps start with diagnosis, make that maybe your priority initially, and then worry about moving into the strategy and the delivery side of things. Do we have any questions coming in? Okay, we've got one coming in. This one might be for you, Tom, or perhaps Charlie. How long before the campaign goes live should people start to plan? So I guess before you want some brand, you want to deliver your brand out into the marketplace, how long should you kind of give yourself to get that right?
Actually, I'm going to pass to Cass to her to talk about the research element of it, and then Charlie and I can add on. Cool. That's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think like as probably you were saying as well, we need to like understand the brand first. There's no point like rushing and getting a campaign out without really understanding what it is we're going to be talking about. What are those values and those key differentiators, similar to the study in Sweden stuff that Charlie was talking about, that we really want to be promoting, that we know is going to engage and resonate with the audience. So it depends on what data and information and insight you currently have and what is still needed. But definitely we would always try and recommend a research phase first to really understand what is your current brand, where are those key points of differentiation, and also to be able to set a benchmark. So if you're investing in your brand, then normally your managers or your managers are going to want to understand what the ROI of that looks like. So having that benchmark as well to show kind of what the current awareness or perceptions are of the institution and then how that can improve year on year is a really great way to do that. But yeah, definitely starting with that research phase, which could be not very long depending on what you've got, or it could be like a few months or maybe 6 months, depending on the extent to which we're looking at how many different audiences you've got that you're considering here, what that campaign looks like and the information that we need from it. So that's from like a research perspective, which would then move into turning that into more tangible assets and a concept through creative and then the advertising.
Yeah, and so sorry, Kaz, feel like I threw you a bit of a highball there. But just from an advertising perspective, looking at planning for the following year and thinking about a kind of 18-month time frame looking forward is the absolute optimum, because then we can see we know the education cycle very well, so we know things that are going to come. We can be really prepared. We can build in to make sure we've got the right research, the right creative, the right setup for the campaign, so that when we go live in market, that there is a really clear execution. So a kind of 18 or 12-month time frame is optimal. Obviously, we can get campaigns live much faster than that. But if we're talking about what's the absolute premium way to do it, we want to be looking further forward. We want to be thinking more long term, and we want to be thinking about measuring that campaign on a 6 to 6 month process.
Cool, thanks, Tom. We've had a couple of other questions come in. So the next question is, what do you think should go into a brand engagement plan for internal audiences? So this is about getting people on board, I guess, from within your organisation. And Kaz and Charlie, I don't know if you've got any good examples from the work you did with Swedish Institute there.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like, and Charlie, you can add to this as well, because you're quite involved with all the stakeholder stuff, but it's getting people involved as soon as possible, whether at like all different levels. I think of stakeholders internally is really important, making sure we're hearing their views and feeding that into then our approach. So in previous projects, we've had stakeholders involved at the very beginning to understand their initial perceptions of the brand, understand how it's currently perceived, all the way through to once the creative is, or I guess like the new branding is created and delivered, but we take them throughout that journey so they're constantly involved and engaged, because there's no point really creating a whole new like branding, I guess, or redefining what your brand is or clarifying what your brand is, if then the key people in your organization aren't behind that and they're not going to use it, they're not going to talk about it. So definitely from my perspective is getting people involved as soon as possible, and taking them throughout that journey.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that you can't plan enough points of feedback and discovery and things as well. I mean, nothing I think is more likely to derail a great brand project than an important stakeholder who doesn't think their voice has been heard early enough in the process. And I think that all the brand projects that we've done most successfully that have kind of come to the best end result are those where we've planned enough of that in, and we've really over planned to hear people's opinions and perspectives from the beginning and throughout, rushing things through by kind of trying to do things in too short a time and skipping space for feedback and input, I think is a shortcut which does not work in the end, because things will always end up getting derailed. So I just think plan for it to take a bit of time, and for people to want their input, because they will.
Thanks, Charlie. We've got a couple of other questions. I think we've got time to cover them. So the next one is, what are the best ways to understand if your brand strategy is working? And Kaz, I think this maybe would go back to you.
Maybe it goes. I think probably there's like two key measurements from my, I guess, like first of all is defining what that brand strategy is, what are you looking to achieve, and then putting some, I guess, metrics or KPIs or goals around that. So that could be anything from changing your awareness to just having a brand strategy, to maybe getting all your key stakeholders involved in that brand strategy and having a clear values and USPs that you're really like promoting through that. Or if we're then talking about more in terms of like activation, there's like key metrics that we've used before to understand if the change in brand has actually been working. So where we might have run a campaign for a client last year, and then in the last 12 months we've been doing research, we've been doing creative, we've been redefining what their brand is, then rerunning similar campaigns to understand the impact of those. So are we seeing more engagement? Are we seeing lower CPC, CPL, CPAs? To understand that actually what we've created from all those like three elements of like understanding, attracting, and reaching those audience has actually worked. Are people more engaged with it? Are we getting the right audience? And therefore we can kind of see that through the advertising metrics. Tom and Charlie, I'm not sure if you've got any other views on that as well. And if not, then we have other questions.
I think you've added from my perspective, Cass. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. Good job.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kaz. And then we've got one more question I think we've got time for. Do we have any suggestions on a process or plan for refining the brand and identifying key selling points to focus on, which covers both research and education? So I guess this is maybe for a more research intensive university as well, beyond just the kind of course delivery, but the broader things that the university is engaged in. And the comment, there were so many potential audiences, it can seem like a big beast. Yeah, totally agree. I guess we covered some of this a little bit in the sense of it is about starting with a phase to define those audiences. And again, I don't know, Charlie or Kaz, although I feel like I first do a lot, Kaz, with study in Sweden, this is something that had to be done up front. It was quite a complex kind of organisation because it's not a university itself that did need a lot of stakeholder engagement, not to mention the kind of Swedish culture of kind of having everybody on board of how that was approached there.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I think the first thing is defining who those audiences are. Who are the key audiences for your institution, and putting more priority on their feedback and their responses throughout any research than maybe some of the other audiences. So I think that's definitely part of like a consultation period at the start before starting any brand project, is mapping out all those audiences, mapping out how important they are to the institution, how much they're like considered, I guess, and then working from there. And it might be that with both those audiences, so both the research side and the education side, or as I was saying before, if it's like businesses you're trying to engage with as well, there might be similarities across those. So it's understanding what those things are and what's going to engage and resonate audiences across the spectrum, and then what's going to be like specific. But it's also trying to understand what is going to differentiate you, what's that kind of one thing that you want to be known for, and then you'll find like the right people that want to go to an organisation that wants to be known for that. So one of the things that we did with the Study in Sweden project, I feel like we've mentioned that a lot, there are other branding projects we worked on, but just because of Charlie's example, is we surveyed over like 6,000 students. We spoke to all their like stakeholders at the universities, at Study in Sweden, and also people like agents that promoted the institution. And what we ended up focusing on more was understanding the perspectives of the students who were the key audiences, and that was the priority for them, who had a really high NPS score. So those that had a really great experience in Sweden and were really big advocates of it, and really understanding from them what were the key selling points, what was really key for them about studying in Sweden, because those are the types of people that we then wanted to engage with and go after. Those are the types of people that are going to love that experience. So understanding their views, as one being the priority audience of being students, but then also being the audience that is then most engaged with that brand, was something that we focused on there. So we focused on their answers and gave more weighting to those than the other audiences.
Thanks, Kaz. Tom or Charlie, do you have anything to add on that at all?
No, only to reiterate, I think having that robust framework to really say, look, this is who we're going after, this is what their problems are, what their needs are, and mapping that back with some really basic things like benefits ladders and all the rest that just give a kind of tangible proof of this is why things are the way they are. I think that the it's also can be so subjective, isn't it, and so many stakeholders and so many opinions, but having that architecture there, having that proof, helps people to kind of remember that this is who the brand's for, this is why it's the way it is, this is what we want to do.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Charlie. And yeah, benefits ladders you mentioned there are a really great tool. We've used those quite a few times to kind of build consensus and just keep that really clear reminder of the priorities, whoever they may be, students or research funding bodies or business partners. It's all about kind of just thinking about your organisation and what's right for you, really. Okay, we don't have any more questions now, so I think we've probably come to the end of the webinar. We are offering a free of charge brand diagnosis meeting with one of our experts. So that will be sent out to you with the post-event communications. You'll also receive a recording of the webinar today. If you want to take advantage of that, you need to sign up before the 30th of October. So do keep an eye out for any communications about it, or drop our marketing team a line. You've got the email address there is marketing@natives.group. But other than that, just to say thank you very much for coming along, and hopefully get to speak to some of you in the future. Thank you.